decided to do slavery within Barbados. As I'll show later on, Barbados is where I was raised, so it shows a bit of history to where I'm from, and also it's an interesting fact that I thought maybe no one would really think about. So as an introduction, so basically what happened to get introduction to how Barbados came to what it was is that the first settlers were the English in 1625 with Captain John Powell who landed. As he was just going around in his boat, they discovered it and they landed. But until 2 years later, they didn't do anything with it. And then 2 years later after that, in 1627, his brother, Captain Henry Powell, was one that came across and actually was the first one to bring settlers to the island. So there was 80 settlers and 10 African slaves that came with him, according to the history of slavery in Barbados. So the main problem was that the fact that slaves were very expensive and they were only found with really the wealthy that would buy them, and they'd be coming over from West Africa. So the plantation owners within Barbados decided to buy the slaves based on their wealth. They'd have more and more. And they'd come from tribes in West Africa, which I'll explain later, but the main two that they came from were Ghana and Nigeria. But these came from, and as it kind of links to what James was saying with slavery, it came from like village raids. And actually it came from families wanting to trade their young for actually gifts and livestock for food. Warlords would actually go into villages and take kids and then decide to actually sell them to plantation owners. Even governments would actually go into countries, for example, if the British had control over somewhere, the British could then take people from their country and decide to sell them to the plantation owners to make money for their country in general. But the fact that if they had control at that time, the power was very sort of great, and no one really messed with it as kind of who was in control was the main aspect. As I said, they were then sold to plantation owners. So just before I get into the point, so why I chose it, as I said, that I was raised in Barbados from the age of 3. So it has a very unique culture with the fact that it's very religious. After the whole slavery and trade came along, it became very religious in the fact that one of the sayings that we learned in school is the fact that a lot of local culture believes that God was the one that sort of helped them to become free, and then that's why one of the main impacts on religion and why it became so sort of religious nowadays. History is being taught in schools. As we'll talk about later on, it kind of, from where they come from to then turn it into sort of a benefit and being able to teach kids about their history and where they've come from. It's really interesting the fact that I think they can turn a bad sort of situation in history and in the past and turn it into sort of a learning curve by teaching kids about their history and where they've come from. And then there is actually still a conflict scene, according to in Barbados, that the fact that there is sort of conflicts between whites and African Americans. However, it isn't normally to do with, say, for example, a white local and an African American local. It has a lot to do with tourists having conflict there. So just some few pictures, if you can see. So on the very top is just an image of what you would see back in the days in about 1627 on to 1630 and the 1640s, of sort of the labor and where they would go through. So I'll talk about the main sources for labor were tobacco and cotton, and it turned into the sugar industry coming from cane, which turned into the production of rum. And you can see those with sort of the ideas of the slave ships, how slaves would be. They'd be chained to the slaves and they wouldn't be released until they got to, say, Barbados, where they were going to be brought to, and the slave owners, the plantation owners, would take sort of ownership of the slaves as they landed or came to the island. So the theories I used were realism and constructivism. So as people kind of said, but realism, I chose power, and that could have been seen kind of with the plantation owners showing sort of authority, power amongst their sort of with their wealth. It was being controlled by the British, so the British ultimately had control over Barbados and what happened with the government and the laws and the policies that were sort of brought upon the island. Then you have the ownership over the slaves and children, as I'll explain later, but it wasn't just ownership over a slave. For example, if for example, a woman or husband slaves decided they were going to have a child, the actual plantation owner would then have ownership and sort of rights over the children as well from the time they were born. And then just overall the structure of how the country was worked with a hierarchy system. I kind of looked at it when I was explaining it as like a pyramid. So you kind of have your bottom level where you have, like, for example, slaves, and very low, like the economic system, you have the slaves at the very bottom, and then it would work its way up, and you'd find at the very top you'd have the plantation owners, who the majority of the time were of white race, and they'd be the sort of the plantation owners, and they'd have the very top, and they'd be the ones that owned the slaves, had all the livestock, the fields where labor was used. So then my other theory was constructivism. So it kind of looks at the culture of the island I looked at. So, as I said before, Barbados is a very religious country, and it's been built over time. It's been implemented that, obviously, as I said, like, God was kind of the one that helped them to be free, and they believe that very strongly, and that's taught in schools. And then slave food has now become sort of a delicacy. So on a Sunday meal, we have something called pudding themselves, which is basically comes from slave food. As plantation owners would take the best bits from, like, for example, the meats, they would use the leftovers, and it would come into sort of slave food, which is now on Sunday meals become delicacies, and it's been shared around the world, more so than the Caribbean. Then you have people's characters. So obviously people's characters over time would be changed and kind of constructed on the way that how sort of the policies were being implemented. People would have different power and rights. Gradually over time, slaves gained more and more rights. And then you have the laws and policies implemented by actually on the slaves, so which I'll talk about a little later, but I don't want to. So after slavery began, so in 1936 they declared a law that basically, as I said, all slaves brought to Barbados, whether white or African American, were to be enslaved for life, also their children. And then during the 1700s, the main source of labor was cotton and tobacco, which, as it started to drop, the sugar industry started to rise. And the Guyanese were imported to actually teach the slaves within Barbados how to farm and for agricultural reasons. Why slaves from Africa? Why would they pick them? So according to my research, I found that it was because of physical attributes. Their strength and physique was one of the main factors. Africa was a lot closer to than Europe, to the Caribbean, so it was a lot easier to get, for example, slaves from West Africa would be brought over to the Caribbean instead of bringing them from Europe. Slave trips, as I said, traveled fast because they're assisted by trade winds blowing towards the west, according to the history of slavery in Barbados. And as I said before, the two main countries where slaves came from were Ghana and Nigeria. So looking at the culture a bit, the culture has changed completely after the emancipation in 1834 in Barbados. Slaves used to work under very strict conditions, which included beatings and punishment and starvation. We in Barbados still have something called corporal punishment, which is implemented in schools and public schools, which can be seen from looking at the history. Punishment was a big thing in Barbados, and beatings have gone on from when slaves were there and came and stayed in the culture until now, where it's still used in education systems. Barbadians still believe that the white race think they're still in charge, so a lot of locals still believe that the white race within Barbados comes over and they believe that they still have authority, and they kind of, you can see that within their culture they've been raised sometimes to think that whites sort of, they think they have that authority and we're not on a sort of a level with equality, and this causes conflict with the fights between races, which is a big thing. You have racial abuse against whites in certain areas, and vice versa. And then you have the emotions towards tourists. Tourism is a big thing for Barbados. It's one of their main sources for income, and if you have people like tourists coming over and you have locals that are sort of have this idealism and the sort of opinions on what's happening, it kind of can cause conflicts within the nation. Culture again. So just spread out the wealth. So you can see within Barbados the wealth, the money is spread out throughout the country now. Back in the days it was very sort of placed within areas, obviously with the plantation owners, when certain areas were more wealthy than others. So the food, as I said, the Sunday meals consisted of pudding and sauce, which is a slave food, which has been brought over from years. Looking at religion, you can